Let me welcome all of you to our 2017 Miller-Upton Forum. This is one of the many programs that we are having this week. This is our 10th annual Miller-Upton Forum. We've been doing these every year for the past 10 years. We began this with our first Miller-Upton scholar, Douglas North, and every year we've been attracting to Beloit College some of the world's top thinkers on the wealth and well-being of nations. And once you start thinking about issues of wealth and well-being and poverty, it's hard to think of anything else because there is so much work to be done. My name is Warren Palmer. I serve as the Albert H. Neese Jr. Professor of Economics, and it's my duty to, my delight really, to design and organize the Miller-Upton Forum. The theme of this year's forum is energy and the wealth of nations. Ending poverty, reducing pollution, and limiting climate change are three of the greatest challenges facing humanity today. These three challenges are tightly linked together, and all three depend upon humanity's use of commercial, inanimate energy. Michael Greenstone, who is at our head table here, is this year's Miller-Upton Scholar, and he has focused much of his career on this triple challenge. He served as the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and is one of the world's most innovative environmental economists. He is the Milton Friedman Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago, and there he is also the director of the Energy Policy Institute, the Energy and Environment Lab at the University of Chicago Urban Labs, and the director of the Becker-Friedman Institute for Research in Economics at the University of Chicago. Today, we have our second panel discussion of this year's Miller-Upton Forum, and today's panel discussion topic is modern energy and the wealth of nations. And we are joined by three extremely interesting speakers, two of whom I have co-authored papers with Professor Greenstone. And before I introduce each of them, let me say that my sole direction to them was, here's the title of the panel discussion, Modern Energy and the Wealth of Nations, and we're interested in what this topic makes you think of. So what they say today will be a delightful surprise to me as well as to you. Our speakers will each come up to the podium, speak in turn for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll invite a response from Professor Greenstone, and following his remarks, we'll then open the floor to questions and comments from all of you. Our first speaker, Rema Hanna, is the Jeffrey Professor of Southeast Asia Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School and the co-director of the Evidence for Policy Design Research Program at the Center for International Development, Harvard University. She is a co-author of Up in Smoke, the Influence of Household Behavior on the Long-Run Impact of Improved Cooking Stoves, co-authored with Esther DeFlo and Michael Greenstone. Our second speaker, Kelsey Jack, is the James L. Paddock Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Tufts University. She is the co-author with Michael Greenstone of Envirodevonomics, a research agenda for an emerging field. And our third speaker is Andrew Revkin, the senior reporter for climate and related issues at ProPublica, which he joined after 21 years of writing for the New York Times, most recently through his .earth blog, which, like me, you may have read with great interest over the years. And he also recently concluded 6 years teaching at Pace University. He has won most of the top awards in science journalism, along with a Guggenheim Fellowship, Columbia University's John Chancellor Award for Sustained Journalistic Excellence, and an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. So you can see we have assembled a very interesting group of panelists today. So please welcome our first speaker, Rema Hanna. Thank you.
Okay, well, the slides are going up. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited for this opportunity to roast Michael Greenstone, as I've been saying all week. But in all seriousness, it's a nice opportunity to honor somebody who's done a lot for the profession, particularly in terms of shaping the way we think about environmental economics in developing countries. And so, thanks. So what I'd like to do today then is talk a little bit about Michael's contributions in development and environmental economics, particularly around why do we even really care about whether or not environmental economics is being focused, a lot of that research is being focused in developing countries or not. So as for me, so I met Michael, was my graduate school advisor 15 years ago, 16, a long time ago. And at the time, I was very interested in development economics, but I was also getting increasingly interested in environmental economics questions. But I felt also very disconnected from the field, in part because it had very much a US-based focus. So if you looked at a lot of the papers at the top conferences in environmental economics, they were all very much focused around the US environmental policies, and what are their impacts. And so for me, I felt a little disconnected from all of that. And I showed up into Michael's office, this crazy development economist talking about wanting to work on these kind of issues, and he was incredibly supportive. And it was not just supportive towards me, but many other young people in the field who were interested in this area. And so for me, I just, in preparation for this, I did a very sort of quick, non-scientific count. So if you look at the top papers, working papers in environmental economics these days, about a quarter of them are focused on developing country and global issues. If you look at the list of a lot of those papers, many of them are Michael's, but also many of them are people like myself, people like Kelsey, who've all been students of Michael's and who he's mentored throughout the years. And so I can't talk enough about the work, how he's really impacted the field. So not even including, in preparation for this, the other thing I did is I went back to go look at Michael's work and felt incredibly intimidated by the fact that he is, in his career, he's amassed 65 papers on environmental economics, and to be honest, they're all in the top journals, they're all very influential papers, well, most of them. And he's worked on topics ranging from thinking about what are the long-run impacts of air pollution on health in China, thinking about temperature and mortality in India, which I know Kelsey's going to talk a bit about. Some of my favorite work is thinking about, well, if you want to get developing country governments to think seriously about environmental regulation, they also have to be able to implement it. So what are the best ways of thinking about how do you actually, for example, get audits of firms to make sure they're in compliance with environmental regulations? How do you get that all done? Or to like random things such as measuring the impacts of toilets in India, and many more. The top of it, I just realized the top of the slides are cut off. But anyway, so the title would say, why do we care about whether or not there's environmental economics research being done in developing countries? If there's research being done in the US setting, why can't we just learn from that and think about what we learned from that and how it applies to developing countries? And for me, I think there's a number a number of different reasons why it's very important. So the first is that the levels of magnitude of differences in pollution and environmental problems is just so different in developing countries than it is in the US. And so I pulled this from a paper that Michael and I wrote at one point where we tried to make this argument. Bear with me for a second. And so we've got particulate levels in the US, India, and China. These are the mean levels, and these are the 99th percentile. And the thing you really you realize from the graph, the order of magnitudes, countries like India and China in terms of particulate levels are so much higher than the mean. And in fact, actually, if you look at the 99th percentile in the US, so the worst of the pollution in the US, that's still way below the mean for India and China. So it just tells you that the magnitude of differences is so high. And that's important if we think that the effect of pollution on health, the effect of pollution, it varies by whether or not pollution is at a very low level or pollution is at a very high level. And in fact, actually, I have some work that I've done where we've looked at this for Mexico City, and we've tried to look at what are the health impacts of pollution in areas where it's much lower, and in fact actually closer to the US estimates of what pollution typically looks like versus the more standard in these areas, and you see differences in the impacts of pollution on health at those different levels. Now, it's not just that pollution is higher. There might be a lot, people might just know a lot less about pollution. There's a lot, in the US, there's a lot of information that's out there in terms of when it's a high pollution day, when it's a low pollution day, but in a lot of developing countries, oftentimes pollution levels are not measured, or if they are, that information has difficulty getting to citizens. And in fact, actually, this is from a survey that I ran also in Mexico City, where we asked people questions about the nature of pollution to try to get at whether or not they knew it was a high or low pollution day. And you can see the probability of them getting the answers right to these questions is very low. So there's this other issue that people might not know that much about pollution and its effects. But on top of that, even if they did know, it might be harder for them to protect themselves. In the US, we have very good medical care. There's different, you have a good housing stock, you've got air conditioning, you've got lots of different ways to protect yourself against the outside air and the outside elements. In developing countries, poor families might not have access to these things. And so there might be more detrimental effect of pollution in these settings. Another reason is that the types of pollution exposure might be very different. And so, for example, the paper that was mentioned that Michael and I worked together on improved cooking stoves comes from this one fact that the worldwide deaths attributed to, there's a lot of focus on ambient air pollution, but if you look at it, the worldwide deaths attributed to ambient air pollution is very similar to those from solid fuels. So what do I mean by this? I mean this. This is not something we see in the US anymore. It's not a problem in the US, but in many developing countries, this is how you cook. It's an open flame. It's in a house that there's not much ventilation. You see this stick over here? It's actually a little pipe. You breathe into it to keep the fire going and then suck in all this horrible pollutants and stuff in the process. And it's just really awful. And if you look at the walls around this stove, it's a little hard to see, I think, in the picture, but this is all black from the soot coming from the stove. So one of the first projects I worked on together with Michael was trying to get at this question of improved cooking stoves. And so we worked with an NGO in Orissa, India, so it's one of the poorest places in India. And this NGO had raised money for a stove distribution program. And they were planning to phase in the distribution of stoves over 5 years. But they had run a stove distribution program before in the past, and they thought it hadn't really worked, but they weren't entirely sure about these things, and so they wanted to do some research around it to understand whether or not it actually have an effect on health, and it would have an effect on the health of women and children in these areas to have a much cleaner stove. So they looked at lots of different types of alternatives to the really dirty stove. And they decided to use one that is relatively common. It's a cheap stove, because in the development sector, there's limited money available for social programs, and so you want to make sure something's cost effective. But it was not only cheap, it was easy to be made locally. These were the most backward of backward areas where you would fly to a city and then then drive to an even more smaller city, and then to get into the rural areas, you're on these really horrific roads. At some point, you couldn't even survey in some of the areas because the monsoon rains had come and the roads were flooded out for 3 months. It's just really difficult to truck in supplies, so you want to figure out things you can do locally. And so this is another picture of the stove that they were trying to evaluate. It was also a mud stove, so as I said, cheap and easy, but the main thing, it has a chimney, and that's supposed to direct smoke out of the household. Okay, so just to, there's a lot of results in the actual work we did. It was a 6-year study, as I said, much data collection, but just the key point from all of this was that even at the beginning, I know the top of this is cut off, but not everybody took up a stove. So even at the beginning, when you gave people a very, very subsidized version of this stove, only 65% of the people took it. Over time, the stoves broke and they stopped using them and so forth. And so you got to, over time, only 44% of people were actually using it by year 3. But what was interesting, and partly why this study for me was very interesting to see, is that it wasn't just that you gave people a stove and then they would suddenly use it. And in fact, actually, what this graph is showing us the number of meals cooked with this good stove. And on average, it started off at a little bit above 3 meals per week, and then it decreased over time to less than 2 meals per week. So people, even when they had a stove, they weren't using it very regularly. They were using their other stove, which they felt was much more convenient. So not surprisingly, since the stoves were not really used that often by the people they were distributed to, we didn't find any effects on health. We didn't find any effects on productivity. So things like, kids are less sick now from respiratory illness and they're going to school more, or now it's easier for me to work on my farmland because I'm coughing less. And we saw none of this. But the reason why I'm talking about this paper in some sense is a little bit less about the paper and the results themselves, but I think one thing for me that this paper did in the environmental economics field is it changed the way people thought about research methodologies around these kind of topics. In the past, a lot of the studies around stoves or other types of environmental technologies were often done in a lab, under the best possible conditions with perfect equipment, and things worked beautifully. But life's not like that, and in the real world with real people make decisions. They don't like this one, they like this one. We all make decisions of how things go along, and if you really want to understand impacts, you have to do it with real people, with real organizations in the field. And the second thing is the scale of it. We could have done something really small. We could have worked with 100 households, made sure all of them got the perfect stove, made sure they used it, put a lot of effort and time in terms of making sure this program went well. But the truth is, we really want to understand things at large scales. When there's real governments and nonprofits going out there and distributing these kind of stoves and running these kind of programs, what does it look like, warts and all? How is it actually going to function in reality? And so for me, this study also, in the environmental economics field, was one of the first big sort of studies of this kind that was really trying to see what happens when you do things at a scale that you would like to do from a policy perspective. And then the final way that I think this study changed the debate around environment and development is that for a lot of these kinds of studies that were actually done in the field at this time, they were often very short. So they would say, giving people an environmental technology and seeing what happens after 6 months. So for us, at 6 months, we actually saw people were using some of the stoves, and we saw some reductions in smoke exposure. So if we stopped our study there, we would have said, there's some reduction in smoke exposure. This is great. We're not seeing health effects, but they'll come in the future, so maybe we should scale up this program. But it was only by year 3 that we saw how people changed their mind about using the technology over time. The technology depreciated, it was hard to fix, people went back to their old habits. Life happened, and you could see that in the end it wasn't really having that much of an effect. So if we did a very short-run study, we would have had very different policy results in the long-run study. And I think this study really, at least for me, made people start thinking about, I have to do something more than just 3 to 6 months to actually really understand behavior. Okay, so again, for me, it's really nice to be here to talk about Michael's contributions to economics and the policy space. With only 15 minutes, there's only so much you could pack in. He's really done quite a lot. But I do want to note, at least, and I am very, very, very grateful for having Michael in my life, because he's somebody who's not only led by his own work and his own example, but for many of us in the field, we're very grateful for the mentoring we received and the support we've gotten, and wouldn't be where we are without him. Thank you.
Thanks for getting us started, Rema. I'm also delighted to be here, and I think that this is, I'm biased, I work in this area, but I think this is one of the most important topics we could all be sitting around discussing today. And what I want to do is, I'm going to be a little bit broader in what I talk about as I was thinking about what to discuss here. I went back to a paper that Michael and I wrote a couple of years ago, where we talked through some of the reasons that Rema actually hinted at of why environmental economics might look different in a developing country standpoint. And we went through a bunch of reasons, and then at the end we had this little section about climate change. And that wasn't really the point of the article, but we felt like we really couldn't write an article about environmental and development economics without mentioning this elephant in the room, which is climate change. And so we say in that paper, we believe that climate change is the most important topic in this kind of cheekily named area of environmental economics, which is really just meant to refer to the intersection of environmental and development economics. And so what I thought I would do is try to flesh out some of the points that we tried to make in this kind of half-page discussion of why we think that climate change is such a big deal for thinking about environmental and development issues in developing countries. And I'm going to really make 4 points. These are, first, they're pretty obvious, but I think when you consider them all at the same time, the implications are a bit staggering. So like Rema's talk, this is going to be a bit depressing. So climate change hurts economic development. I think we all know and believe that. I'm going to show you some of the recent research that tries to quantify these relationships. Second, this doesn't matter as much if you're rich. So the poorest places in the world are the ones that are going to be most affected. This suggests that a good adaptation strategy is to get richer so that you can protect yourself from these impacts. But this process is often a carbon-intensive one. And then where I'm going to wrap up is to say that this suggests we need some new strategies going forward. And so fortunately, Michael's going to come up here at the end and make some responses and conclusions. And so the fact that I won't have much to say on that 4th point, I'll hand it over to the expert. Okay, so on the first point, there's a growing body of research that really tries to quantify this relationship between changes in climate, which are hard to measure, and so oftentimes what researchers are using are variations in weather. So something that we actually can measure and observe, and then trying to understand how those impact economic outcomes. So I'm going to show you a series of figures from recent studies that show a number of different impacts where we're seeing hotter days in particular are associated with worse economic outcomes. So these are 2 figures that I think capture this well. Let me talk about the one on the right, which is a paper that Michael was a co-author on. And the way to read these figures is on the horizontal axis, we have bins of daily average temperature. So this is actual real observed variation in temperature outcomes. On the vertical axis, we have some kind of an economic outcome. So in this case, we have measures of mortality. And the kind of thought experiment to think of underlying these kinds of figures is, what if we took a day out of this temperature bin that's sort of benchmarked here, and put it into a higher temperature bin? And so these are observed relationships, but then this figure is constructed so that we remove the fact that some places are just hotter places than others, some years are just hotter years than others, and really identify off of the fact that what if we shock a place with a higher temperature, what does that mean for mortality outcomes? And so what this figure is suggesting is, this is data from India, that higher temperatures kill you, literally, right? So these are mortality impacts from temperature in India. The figure on the left is showing you that this is true in more developed countries as well. These are data from Italy. And it's not just these really dramatic outcomes like people are dropping dead, literally. It's also a number of other kind of economic measures, and this is a summary paper that recently came out in Science, so I put the citation down at the bottom if you want to go look up some of these figures on your own afterward. This really summarizes a lot of what we know at this point about sort of climate damages on a micro scale. So we see similar things with measures of income and productivity. Higher temperatures are worse for income and productivity. You see this with conflict. You also see this with what on the face of it look like kind of mundane outcomes, like the use of profanity in social media. But in some ways, this is a really nice summary measure of the fact that people are just less happy when the temperature is bad. So it's not just that we're going to see the economy doing worse, it's that utility, it's that sort of human well-being, even on the most mundane level, is potentially going to be worse in the face of climate change. So this is probably all stuff that you knew, that climate change isn't great news from the perspective of economic outcomes. This suggests that more warming leads to more climate damages. It also turns out that people are decent at offsetting these kinds of impacts. But the things that we call adaptation, the ability to experience higher temperatures and be less harmed by them, that's an expensive prospect. And so when we compare richer places in the world with poorer places in the world, what we see is that the richest places in the world are the ones that are less sensitive to these variations in things like temperature or precipitation. This is a figure from a different paper in Nature recently that just divides the countries in the world into richer and poorer countries. And what you can see from this is that the richer countries, this black line, show considerably less responsiveness, considerably less sensitivity to variations in temperature, while the poorer countries, this gray line, are much more sensitive to changes in temperature relative to what they're used to experiencing. This is on a really summary measure of GDP. We can also go back to the mortality data. This is from a paper hopefully published soon. I've been teaching this to my students for years now. I'm looking forward to showing them the published version, Michael. So this is again, the way to read this figure is take a day out of kind of a pleasant day, in the lower 70s, and turn up the temperature. What happens to mortality? This is showing you the same data from India that I referred to on the earlier slide, where you can see that hotter days are really bad for mortality rates in India. Well, we do that same analysis in the US, and we see almost no response, right? So you take the temperature up a notch in India, this has serious impacts that show up even in terms of mortality, whereas that same variation in temperature in the United States, we have found ways to protect ourselves. This is true even if you compare rural and urban India. So, there are lots of differences between the United States and India. What if we just zoom in on India and compare places in rural areas, again, this red line, versus places in urban India? Even in urban India, people have found pretty good ways of protecting themselves from variations in temperature. So in the back of your head, you can be thinking about there are lots and lots of channels through which this is flowing. It's not just literally people are feeling the heat and that's what's killing them. This is affecting agricultural incomes. This is affecting all kinds of other things that are going to end up showing up in mortality data. A really striking additional paper that Mike has published recently that I'm going to follow up on in the next point compares the United States in the first half of the 1900s versus the United States in the second half of the 1900s. So this is kind of a similar figure. These are a little bit small fonts for you to see, but what this is showing is that in the early years, high temperatures had huge impacts on mortality in the United States. So this is 1929 to 1959, whereas post-1960, this relationship levels off hugely. So something has changed. Lots of things have changed, right? The United States is a completely different country now than it was, many decades earlier. But among the things that have changed has been the ability to experience hot days and not die as a result. right? And so this is potentially a useful lesson for thinking about, well, what is it that people are doing to, in the crudest sense, adapt to climate change, right? If adaptation just means not being impacted by some of the effects of climate change. So what this suggests is that, you know, if you can get yourself onto this other trajectory and find ways to adapt, that the damages associated with that same amount of warming, right? Remember, these are the same kind of observations of high temperatures, that those have less of a consequence for you. And I think, as I've shown you, this seems to be easiest in the places where people are relatively well off. And you know, so in some ways what this implies is that the best adaptation strategy, if you're a low-income country or a low-income household even in a high-income country, the best thing for you to do is find a way to increase your income so that you're in a position to do the things that help protect you from the impacts of climate change. What we know about this process is that the most obvious ways to do this tend to be carbon-intensive ways, right? So first of all, rich people relative to poor people consume a lot more carbon-producing things, right? The carbon emissions associated with the lifestyle of an average person in a high-income country, much, much more carbon-intensive than the average lifestyle of somebody in a low-income country. And in particular, one of the other figures from this paper of Michael's that compares the US in recent times to the US in the past and looks at these mortality differences from high temperatures, what this figure is showing is that what the cutoff title says is that air conditioning saves lives. What this is basically showing is that as air conditioner penetration rates increase, so counties are able to have access to more air conditioners, this, to use a pun, kills the effect of climate on mortality, right? So places where people have access to air conditioners are not experiencing the same kind of mortality impacts as places where people don't have access to air conditioners. And so, of course, there are lots of other things changing over this time period, but this is, in some ways, like really compelling evidence that a single technology can change things dramatically for people. Yet, what this is asking is, so then what does that imply for climate policy in developing countries? One thing you could conclude is, well, this is the way forward, this is the future, right? Just find a way to get people into air-conditioned buildings. That plausibly explains at least some of the difference between urban and rural India, is that urban India has access to some of these technologies, whereas rural India really doesn't. But more seriously, what it suggests is that if you want to protect the population from the impacts of climate change, then the best way to do that is to find a way, rather than worrying so much about mitigation, rather find a way to get your population up to the standards of living where they can afford to buy things like air conditioners. So, and also to get to the point where the income sources that people have are less sensitive to climate impact. So people are less dependent on agriculture, for example. They're more dependent on economic activity that's not going to collapse in the face of warmer temperatures or less precipitation. This is great for adaptation, but it can be problematic from a mitigation standpoint. These are data from a different study in Mexico, and what we have here is annual household income on the horizontal axis and the share of households with air conditioners on the vertical axis. And what this is showing, this is not the government pushing air conditioners on people, this is just what happens when you make people a little bit richer in a hot place. Well, they go out and buy air conditioners. And what you probably can't read is the scale here goes up to 80% of households with air conditioners, and this is happening at pretty low levels of income. Around $10,000 or $15,000 a year, people are going out and buying air conditioners. This is a really good investment for them in a place where temperatures are high. And yet we also see with these air conditioners, this is another figure of the same type that I showed you before, as we turn up the temperature, it's not just that people are buying more air conditioners, it's also that they're using them more. The whole point of buying an air conditioner is to turn it on when it's hot out, right? And if we think that climate change is going to make it hotter, then it's not just that richer people are going to be able to buy these things, it's also that they're going to be using them more. And so we can think of sort of both of these adjustments as driving up energy use in developing countries. So as people get richer, the demand for air conditioners is increasing. This is good news from climate adaptation standpoint. They can protect themselves from high temperatures, but it's really bad news because, as we all know, air conditioners are really intensive expensive producers of greenhouse gases, right? So then what this slide says, the title is, well, what about mitigation, right? We all think that the real way to deal with climate change is through mitigation. The problem is that mitigation is a public good, right? So if India tries to cut back on some of its carbon emissions, India gets a little bit of benefits from that, but all of the rest of us get benefits from that too. Whereas a lot of adaptation investments are much more kind of in the domain of private goods, where if a country or a household or whoever goes out and buys an air conditioner, yes, they're spending money on it, but they get to recoup a lot of those benefits privately. So you don't have these same kinds of problems of market failures around these kinds of adaptation investments. And this is going to be a particularly stark trade-off if you're in the position of being a poor country or a poor household, where that dollar is really, really valuable to you. Your interest in spending it on something that's going to benefit everybody is presumably much less. So what this suggests is that we've got this kind of problematic feedback loop arising, right? Where warming, if you're rich, maybe you can get onto this adaptation pathway, but that's going to in turn lead to more warming, where the poor people are then going to be experiencing more damages, right? And so thinking forward, and this is where I stop having anything really to say, thinking forward, this requires new adaptation strategies. So first of all, we kind of want to find ways to adapt in straightforward ways where self-interested countries and individuals are interested in pursuing that doesn't have these kind of negative feedbacks. And second, we would really like people to get to the standard of living where we're moving off of this negative pathway onto this more positive pathway. And yet, this is something that I think remains a really open question. So Michael was on this recent science paper that concluded, one of the three most important areas in climate change economics is to better understand what's going on in developing countries. How do we deal with these kinds of problems in developing countries? And I think that, to me, this puzzle that I've just laid out is sort of the most compelling and challenging issue going forward. And so hopefully Michael's going to be able to give us an answer on this one. Thank you.
So that was a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to keep my thoughts brief, and I'm going to build a little bit on what you heard. I'm Andy Revkin again. I'm just a journalist. I'm not a scientist. Although I was a member of the Anthropocene Working Group for 6 years, working with a bunch of scientists to figure out if humans have indeed become a geological force on the planet. The answer was yes. There are lots of questions that remain. So I'm actually an author of a bunch of papers, I've done a PhD, which is kind of great. The title of this was clearly ripping off of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. So I thought I'd mention a fun interaction I had through my blog at the Times.Earth related to Adam Smith. There was a guy, I had heard on NPR one day, there was an interview with a guy named Charles Handy, who's a social philosopher focused on economics, and he mentioned, this is years ago, he mentioned something that rang my bell. It was this, he said that Adam Smith, one of his less known writings was at one point he talked about that societies, the challenge of the market model of progress is it leads to the, quote, endless pursuit of unnecessary things. And I immediately, because on .earth I was writing a lot about the broader sustainability question, it kind of literally rang my bell. It pushed all those little neurons that we have when there's this phrase psychologists have called confirmation bias, where you look at a bunch of things and the one thing that matches the way you feel or think is the thing that you focus on, and that happens a lot in the climate change arena. And so this, it seemed great, and I poked around and it seemed to be real. And this guy Charles Handy was a big-time thinker in England, and so I wrote this piece about the endless pursuit of unnecessary things, and I used imagery from this amazing film about Ed Burtynsky, where he runs around the world and he was showing people what it's like in these giant factories in China, and I wrote a lot about consumption. And then some other blog, kind of a skeptical blog on everything related to Adam Smith. There's a blog that's like the Adam Smith reality blog. And they did some poking around, and they claim still that there's no evidence he actually wrote those words. And I would love to know, so this is your homework assignment. it's not in Wealth of Nations, but it may be in his book about moral side of things. So someone find out if it's real or not. And my job as a journalist is kind of like that. It's looking at things. It's knowing that I have a bias. I like to have a better planet. I like to have people in less poverty. I like to have less climate change. But I always have to test. You heard the word evidence. And what's great about what Rema is doing is sort of trying to inject evidence into how policies are crafted and dealing with development. And quite often what we get in the arenas that we're focused on today, and not just those arenas, but other arenas, is what one fellow, he works in England, but he's German, Oliver Gieden, during the run-up to Paris, the Paris Agreement, he talked about this habit we have of not doing policy-based evidence-making, not doing evidence-based policy-making, but doing policy-based evidence-making, which is kind of that confirmation bias thing, but in a more strategic way, where you look at data and you, the policymaker, or you, the climate treaty campaigner, you just pick the stuff that helps propel your change in your way. And that's something that's why this work is really important. One thing that it would be good for them to talk about, Michael and her, about the reaction, which gets at this inconvenient information when there's momentum towards some presumed solution can lead to a lot of the opposite of confirmation bias, which is kind of like when something challenges your line of thinking, you attack it. And that's a real challenge, especially when the findings go against conventional wisdom. And that happens a lot in the progressive side of things. And so thinking about, as you craft careers, those of you who are still at early stages, get your armor together, get used to dispute. Science is all about dispute anyway. Science progresses through dispute. But when it gets to be policy relevant, then there's these other layers that get in the way of progress, even when the information can be there. I want to say a few quick things about a couple elements, aspects of this. Kelsey, it's Kelsey, right? Yeah. She wrote some really important facts too about adaptation, resilience building. And I first wrote about that aspect of the climate problem in 2002, I think it was, when it was broached in the context of these climate treaty talks. And it was around 2002 that it finally became kind of safe to even mention the word adaptation. In Al Gore's first book on climate change, Earth in the Balance, he called it immoral to talk about adaptation because basically it feels like a cop-out. But the reality is, as others have said much more since then, like John Holdren, this whole climate problem is a mix of adaptation, mitigation of emissions, and pain, and here and there some benefits, the longer growing seasons in some places, that kind of thing. So it is a hybrid future, and it's good to see adaptation come to the fore. But even there, you have these other layers of reality that can get in the way of how things progress. And if you look at out in the West, the Midwest, in the fire zones in the West, or the flood zones in Houston, the pattern, there's been a lot of discussion of the climate change component. Remember, super heavy rainfall, some part of that is due to the heating of the oceans and atmosphere, so there's more moisture. So when you have a rainstorm, more stuff comes out. That's pretty basic. But there's a lot of other things that have been changing too. And I've been writing about this pattern, wildfire zones. There's this thing called the wildland-urban interface. There's even a hashtag, WUI, W-U-I. And we've been doing a lot of building, and a lot of growth has happened in this area where people and wilderness or forests or grassy landscapes merge. And the greatest source of growth and fire risk and losses is human development, where we're building, how we're building. All those homes that sadly were incinerated in Santa Rosa, go on YouTube and search for the word ember, like embers, and wind, and you'll find these amazing videos showing there's a research center where they have, it's like a wind machine with ember creating things, and they put up a house, and you can see how these embers find their way into the little cracks in the house. So those things are as important as thinking about climate change for sure. And there's something that's tractable, whereas even if there is a climate component in that fire, the fire weather, suppose you started rapidly cutting CO2 emissions today. Suppose Al Gore or somebody like that became world president, and that wouldn't be perceptible in the climate system for decades, because the system has momentum and has natural variability. So, and that's a reality, that's a fact, but it's a fact that is inconvenient for a lot of people who have a certain focus or a certain priority going forward. So finding your way, choosing whether you want to be fact-based or not, it's a choice, actually. And sadly, we're not set up really well to do the fact-based thing. There are these outliers. You've heard from 2 or 3. You'll hear from 3. They're very much outliers. Even within science, the time scales you choose. As we heard, if you choose to just do a 6-month study, then that's really constraining the power of your conclusions. But that might be strategically valuable to you. So those tensions will be there going forward in your research. Funders can end up influencing things like that. And it's kind of an interesting challenge. This business I said about how we're badly set up for this, for being evidence-based, came to be very late in my reporting career. The first 20 years of my reporting on climate change, from 1988 until 2006, was all simplistic, because I kind of grew up in the 20th century thinking of environmental problems as some discrete thing. There's a smokestack and stuff's coming out and it's creating problems, and so you put some filter on it and you fix it. And a lot of my reporting, a lot of the environmental problems that we faced had that structure. So, I won awards. Became a good climate reporter through those years. But it was in 2006, that's when the conversation around climate change devolved into this real pissing match, and everyone was yelling. And I wrote this piece for the Sunday Times Week in Review section called "Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet." And it was the first time I really started to talk to people like sociologists and psychologists about this problem. And that was that was, for me, revelatory and very distressing, because everything they told me was science-based. There's some, uncertainty in every body of science. But it basically said that information mostly doesn't matter, Mr. Journalist, who spent 20 years writing prize-winning fact-based stories about climate change, thinking they're going to change people. And one of the people I talked to is a guy named Dan Kahan, K-A-H-A-N, who's at Yale. He runs a research effort on what he calls cultural cognition. And if you want to sort of force yourself to hear some inconvenient facts, go to that culturalcognition.net website. And one of the quotes that he has there, summarizing some of his empirical studies, is, "What you believe about climate change doesn't reflect what you know. It reflects who you are." And that gets it. But for those who were at the last night's session, we heard these people in Oklahoma who completely reject that global warming is driven by humans, and had other beliefs about energy and stuff. So that's a really valuable comment, because it means that having a fact-based argument with somebody who's fundamentally different tribal affiliation than you are, a cultural affiliation, is not going to get very far. And one of his findings that's most disturbing for a science writer is that the level of basic science literacy among people who have a position on climate change is highest at the furthest ends of the curve. So the people who are most engaged, whether you reject it or accept it, are the ones who have the most science literacy, even on basic facts of climate science. So this idea that, and a lot of people have been pushing this idea lately, that if we have better education, better communication of basic science facts on climate change, that we'll magically decarbonize. And that's kind of not the way it works. There are ways forward, and that's, communicating science effectively is important, but it's not like that's the solution. And as a communicator, that was kind of a challenge. But I've gotten past it. There's ways to go forward. The other thing, one last thing, and I mentioned this last night though, is this phrase I said last night: there is no we in dealing with an issue like energy or climate. Because you look around the world and you have people who are completely undercarbonized and people who are you could argue, over-carbonized. It would have too big a footprint of energy and climate. This brings me to this little illustration. Well, I'll get to that in a second. I want to get a couple more points across first. So there's no we when it comes to energy needs. We are comfortable. You know, I flew here yesterday and I'll fly back tomorrow, and planes and air conditioning and all the things that give us the wealth that we have, the well-being we have. A lot of them are based on energy. Fertilizer for crops, where does that come from? It's energy intensive. So it's water. California, LA supposedly uses almost as much energy to move water to LA as it uses when you plug stuff in LA. So the electricity footprint of LA's citizens using electricity out of the wall is about the same. This may be an out-of-date statistic, but it's roughly similar to the amount of power that's used to get water to LA. So this is, we're infused in it, and I've spent a little bit of time in India this year, and you see what it's like to be undercarbonized. And that's where I want to touch on this. There's this, one of the big pushes in the climate arena has been low carbon development. That, well, we are living this high revving lifestyle, but, we know better now. So even as we continue to live this high revving lifestyle, we would love it if developing countries could find some really cool, low energy, low carbon lifestyle. The problem is it ends up looking like a low energy lifestyle. So what do you see here? This is the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves was formed in 2010 to try to bring some coherence to this effort to get better cooking options to 500 million households. And a big component of what they were trying to do is build a market, carbon trading way to do this. And they still, to this day, have this illustration on their website. I'll explain a little bit. It's basically rich world on the left is emitting a lot of CO2 and has a lot of money. And poor world on the right could use money, and they have ways to cut CO2. So if we just pay them a little bit so that these cleaner cook stoves are used instead of open fires, all will be well. So that's kind of their interpretation of this diagram. But when I look at it, or I showed it to some people in developing countries, and they kind of laugh. Because it basically says, we get to keep on doing all the things we do, and you guys can burn your firewood a little bit more cleanly. And that is something that's worth examining. And this is just a proxy for a much bigger discussion about paths forward on development. Last thing on the idea of adaptation involving air conditioning, I've just written a book that's coming out this spring that's there's 100 moments in the history of our relationship with weather and climate. And one of them is the invention of air conditioning. It's really an amazing story, as so many things are. 1902, this young engineer named Carrier, there's probably a Carrier air conditioner right here, he was assigned to fix a printing plant in Brooklyn where the ink was running because it was too humid. And he came up with this dehumidifying system that became air conditioning. And the first place that got it, what was the first, it was used in chocolate factories and printing plants at first. And then the first place that had air conditioning in an office kind of space like this, where do you think it was? Say again?
The White House?
No, the White House, good guess. No, it was the New York Stock Exchange. All these sweating people, trading money. And then it was the movie theaters. The reason we ended up in the 30s onward with those matinees on Saturday matinees in the summer was because they're air conditioned. And now, so the energy department has so the question going forward, and this relates to this low carbon development, is what mix of going forward for countries that are yet air conditioned is through innovation. The energy department has a program of trying to get next generation air conditioning that doesn't have the same refrigerants and has much lower energy footprint. So that's like an opportunity for someone here to become the next Carrier, come up with a way to do that that's low energy, low cost, low environmental cost. And the other one is like in Japan, where a few years ago they stopped, they moved to where short sleeve shirts became cool at work. Or maybe New York City offices will have Bermuda shorts like they had, that's normal in Australia. So that's kind of a different kind of adaptation. And those are all questions to examine. There's no simple answer going forward, and dialogue is essential. Data really matter. ProPublica, where I now work, is data-driven to the max. And if you don't have data, then we'll expose that. And if you do have data, we'll analyze it. So that's what's happening with me with stoves right now. So we are outliers though. So until we become, don't expect us to be the norm, this group of scholars and me, but someone has to pursue reality even in a landscape that's most often driven by things other than reality, or where the reality is that we're divided by our beliefs more than by data. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Okay, it's an honor to be here and have such 3 excellent stars speak in front of me. And now it's a challenge trying to figure out how to stitch together what they said and what I can try to make of that. So let me just start by saying I'm incredibly grateful to Rema, Kelsey, and Andy for taking time to do this. Andy and I would like to say are getting to know each other. We were joking at lunch, I think of Rema as a friend, I think of Kelsey as a friend, maybe one day I'll find out what they think of me. I think most importantly, in my relationships with Rema and Kelsey, have been co-authoring relationships. And you look for several things from co-authors. I think number 1 is you want someone you can learn from. Both of them I've learned tremendous amounts, either co-authoring or just chit-chatting on the sides of conferences, and I'm grateful for that. You hope that number 2, learning will help you understand the world in a different way, and that's definitely true in both of their cases. Somewhat comically, and I will return to this, Rema was involved in my first trip to a developing country, and I think was extraordinarily concerned that I did not understand what I was getting into. And in the era of helicopter parenting, Rema was helicopter co-authoring, trying to make sure that I made it through my trip in India. But maybe the most important thing among the 3 things that are looked for in a co-author is that they're fun. And again, Rema and Kelsey are both stars of that dimension. I always am excited to find some reason to call them and talk about this, that, the other thing. And Andy, thank you for your work, which I've been an admirer of for a long time. It's a real honor to get to know you better. And I've been calling Rema and Kelsey friends for a long time, probably much longer than they ever thought of me as a friend. They just may not yet. So I'm working toward that with you. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how my research developed and what I see as a kind of broader meaning across these 3 excellent talks. So I think what I was, just to level set, I was born in Chicago. I don't think I had a passport until I was about 2000, until the year 2000. I'm getting older. And I think my vision of the world didn't really go that much further than Chicago. And then in graduate school, one thing led to another, and I got interested in energy environment problems. And so the natural thing seemed to be, well, I should study things in the US. And I kind of was happily beavering away doing that. And then, once in a while I would look out the window or look at a graph, like the graphs Rema and Kelsey showed, and say, oh, looks like the energy environment problem might be a little bit different in developing countries. And I had always wanted to find some way to make a difference and find the big questions and things that would be meaningful for people's lives. Those are real numbers that Kelsey and Rema put up. And I think the magnitude of the challenges and the opportunities for improvement in well-being are just enormous in the case of developing countries broadly, but specifically with respect to environmental issues. And both Kelsey and Rema played important roles in my coming to understand that, maybe too slowly. So then I kind of began on this path of trying to, well, okay, so there are these other countries in the world, and there's lots of people living in them, and things seem challenging there. and tried to bite off a series of kind of what seemed like reasonable questions, like what are the consequences of air pollution for people's health, both indoor and outdoor pollution? Can you have effective regulatory policy in developing countries? A series of questions like that. But I think I was still kind of struggling for, well, what did it all mean? And like, were these just little bite-sized facts about the world, or was there some larger thing to try and pull out of that? And I'll talk more about this tonight, but I think what came to me is that in some respect, what all of it means is that there's what I like to call the global energy challenge. And I see that as this incredibly complex, fascinating set of questions that really revolve around three issues I like to think of as a stool. These are like the three legs of the stool. And I think each leg has a number that kind of sticks in my head. So the first leg, the number that sticks in my head is 130 kilowatt hours of energy consumption per year. That's how much the state in India called Bihar. There's 120 million people who live there. There's only 300 million people who live in the US. Their per capita electricity consumption is 130 kilowatt hours per year. In the US, you know, we got it's about 13,000. So they're off by 2 zeros. And it doesn't take much introspection to think about what that means and what life must be like. So the first leg of the stool, I think, is how do you ensure that people around the world have access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy? The second leg of the stool, the number that kind of can't get out of my head, is like 3 to 4 years of life expectancy. So I think the pollution levels that Rema put up are in India and China. Those aren't just like readings on some device that one of my former remote sensing colleagues at MIT might have made, but those marks, ticks on that list as you go from 350 or 325 down to probably here for the common metric outside this window, it's probably like 20 or 30 or something like that. There's life being lost there. And in particular, I think, if India or China had air pollution levels that met the World Health Organization standards, people there would live somewhere between 3 to 5 years more. And you just think about what that means. It's not like just the years from 85 to 90. That's elevated rates of mortality for infants, for young kids, even for prime age adults. So I think the second leg of the stool that is not less important than the access to energy is how to manage the byproduct of our energy consumption, which comes, the unwanted byproduct, which comes in the form of air pollution. The third number that I think represents a leg of the stool, which was in Kelsey's presentation, is how vulnerable people in developing countries are to climate change. And the number that I like to is when she had this comparison of what does the effect of a hot day do for mortality rates in India versus the United States. And I don't know if she used this statistic, I don't think she used this exact statistic, but if you took the ratio of those two things, it's 25 times the mortality impact in India than it is in the United States. And so, to the question about adaptation and climate change, if you're in India, you really don't want to be on that red line and shut up like that. You're desperate to be on the blue line. And so, the third leg of the stool is how do you manage climate change while also managing air pollution and also trying to manage the need for access to energy. And so, I think sadly, part of the answer does not lie in blackboard economics. It would be great if it did. But I think at the end of the day, these are not exactly our problems. I'm going to come to what we can contribute to them. But these are problems of the people and the countries that are confronted with these challenges. And ultimately, they're going to find solutions. Those solutions they may not be things we like. but they're going to reflect their level of income. Kelsey pointed to some examples of that. They're also going to reflect values. They're going to reflect morals. They're going to reflect culture. All these kind of things that are at least not easily inside the box of economics. And there's, you know, Andy used the phrase that there's no we in energy, and there's really no we in solving this, I think, incredible challenge that many parts of the world face. And they're going to do it in different ways, and it'll reflect their priorities and their values. So what can we, sitting here in Beloit, Wisconsin, possibly add to that? I think there's, and I guess I should add, what can we add to that without being paternalistic, which I think is a trap that often happens. And I think one thing I think we can do, I guess, is not be paternalistic. And we can accept and recognize people's preferences for what they are, not what we might like them to be. The stoves paper that Rema talked about was really a terrific example of that. I think clean stoves have a lot of appeal if you're sitting here in Beloit or if you're sitting in an NGO in the United States. They are a way to reduce this problem, indoor air pollution, for households in India, and also possibly do something to reduce carbon emissions. It turns out, and I think Rema and Nestor are third author on that paper, and I are still not exactly sure why, but it turns out people don't like those stoves. And it sure would have been nice sitting here in Beloit or in Washington, D.C. if they had. We had a ready-made solution, but they didn't like them. And when they didn't like them, they didn't use them, they didn't take care of them, they fell into disrepair, and eventually it was as if we'd never given away the stoves, more or less. And so I think that it's important to recognize, people are in charge of their own lives. Another area where that has kind of been driven home to me is in a current project that I have ongoing, which has many of the same, much of the same field, which is, I think, sitting in Beloit or sitting in an NGO in Washington or something. Solar microgrids for people in poor countries seem like a terrific idea. Why? They don't have lots of access to energy. There's this number about 130 kilowatt hours. And so it's natural, and by the way, if they would just use that, then they wouldn't have to use coal, and it wouldn't hurt us, limit the damages we would face from climate change. So it seems like a great deal. Similar to this study that Rema discovered stoves, I've been engaged in a paper that did something like that with solar mini grids, where this time wasn't free, but we offered them at really reduced prices. There's several findings, but maybe the most important finding for me at this point is the only price at which people were willing to buy these things was a price below the cost of the to a first approximation. So their preferences for alternative sources of electricity have to be just as their preferences for stoves have to be. So I guess what can we do? The first thing is it isn't really our problem in some level. It has influence on our lives, but we have to avoid a tendency to be paternalistic, and so that's number one. Number two, now Andy and I have not been friends as long as Rema and Kelsey and I, although we're still trying to establish it. Rema and Kelsey and I are friends, we're just colleagues. But I felt like the Andy Revkin I know and admire was wavering on stage about facts. And that maybe he was still committed to facts, but I could see the arrows sticking out of the side of him. And I want to make an argument at a college, so it's a safe place to do that, for facts. And I think facts are critical. And I think facts are especially critical when it comes to the climate and the global energy challenge. And I'll make two examples. Without facts, I think there's a great risk, and we have an excellent track record as a society of pursuing policies that make us feel good about the energy and the global energy challenge, but don't actually achieve what we want. I found that in several instances in my research. It has not always made me the most popular person, but it is, I think, facts are important. If you know, you could just keep proceeding down the wrong path for an endless amount of time. I felt Andy searching a little bit for better communication skills, so if he's searching for better communication skills, we are screwed. And, you know, I worked in the Obama administration for a year, and there the idea was that, you know what, if we talk, it's too hard to talk about climate change. They read the same things Andy was talking about, so let's stop talking about it and let's start talking about green jobs. Maybe people won't pay attention to the climate change part. You know, I think the green jobs experiment was not a very successful experiment. It didn't fool anyone. People understood what was going on. People understand you're really talking about climate change, and were suspicious of it. So I agree communication is important. It's something I think we all scientists have to work on, but it's important not to get sidetracked and off of the fact-laden path. Okay, and then, you know, I am an economist, so of course we're going to have to, the third thing, which is the way to end this, is, you know, what is the third thing we could do? Well, it's so obvious. We could get markets right. And a lot of energy markets are all screwed up. And the way that, there's a couple of ways in which they're screwed up. Most saliently, we choose to set energy prices in a way that do not reflect 3 to 4 years of lost life expectancy from air pollution, not just here, but also most poignantly in developing countries. Prices don't reflect that. In fact, energy, pollution-laden energy is often subsidized. So it's like, they got the idea right, we should change the market price, but they just have the direction wrong. And so that seems like something we could do. And of course, this is also true as it relates to climate change. Now, their evaluation of climate change might be different than ours, but the climate damages associated with the use of fossil fuels should be reflected in prices. And the last thing, again, searching under the heading of market failures, is there really is a market failure in innovation. And there are plenty of firms who will not invest in innovation, or at least as much as we would be ideal socially, because they're not going to be able to benefit. Rema will steal their idea, and they know that, so they'll do less than they would if they could fully protect their idea. And that there's a clear case for government subsidies or funding of basic R&D, and I think doing it in the energy space, particularly around clean energy, seems like an especially fruitful area to do it these days. So that's my effort to try and make sense of these 3 excellent talks. Thank you very much.